Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you all for joining us virtually today. I'm 𝐀𝐠𝐞𝐧𝐝𝐚, Director of Business Development. And to get to know me just a little bit better, my primary focus here at GEP has been on our energy and utilities practice, where I've had the privilege of collaborating with some of the leading utilities in the industry. I hope you're all ready for an exciting session ahead. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll be together discussing power purchase agreements and virtual power purchase agreements, or PPAs and VPPAs. I know that's a mouthful for me to say, but we'll get used to it throughout our session. Be prepared to actively engage. We've set aside about 15 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. So please post your questions in the comment box, and we'll address them at the end of our session. And if we don't manage to answer all of the questions during our live session, rest assured that we will respond to them offline. With that said, let's jump into it. In today's world, where companies are increasingly focused on sustainability and reducing their carbon footprint, renewable energy has become a prominent topic of interest. PPAs and VPPAs provide a viable solution for companies looking to meet their energy needs, while also accelerating the adoption of renewable energy sources. These agreements are revolutionizing the way companies approach energy procurement consumption, enabling them to achieve their goals through decarbonization, cost savings, and operational efficiencies. During our session, we're going to explore the mechanics of these agreements, the current landscapes of the industry, and really dive into specific use cases and risks for utility companies. We'll be talking to 𝐀𝐠𝐞𝐧𝐝𝐚, GEP's energy and utilities subject matter expert. He's going to share his expertise, insights, and practical experiences really related to PPAs and VPPAs. And our goal is really by the end of this session that you're going to have a comprehensive understanding of what the mechanics are behind these agreements, insights into the industry, and trends into who's really leading the way. So by way of introduction, 𝐀𝐠 has been with GEP for the past 5 years. He's delivered some of the most complex procurement programs focused on energy generation strategy, capital spending, O&M cost reduction, and process design for GEP's energy and utilities clients. In his current role, he's engaging with leading multi-billion-dollar sourcing effort for a Midwestern utility focused on generation capacity expansion and energy transition. So 𝐀𝐠, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Colleen, for having me. Really excited for the session.
Great. So now that everyone knows a little bit about who we are, let's kick things off, go right into our session. 𝐀𝐠, we have an audience from different industries today. Maybe we can start with just an understanding of what exactly is a power purchase agreement before we discuss VPPAs.
Sure, absolutely. So fundamentally, PPA is a simple sale and purchase agreement for power. You have two parties. You have your developer, who is the seller of energy, and you have the off-taker in industry terms that we call, they are the buyers of the energy. So through the PPA contract, the seller and the buyer agree upon a fixed price for a certain amount of duration, so typically about 10 to 20 years. So what this does is it provides a assured revenue for the seller, so that they could finance the project and build the project, and the developer and then the buyer takes the delivery of the power that's generated from the project, right? Since it is the buyer whose assurance of that price led to the creation of that whole capacity in the first place, they get to own the renewable energy credits or renewable energy certificates that are generated from the project. So this is how simply a typical PPA works.
Okay, so can a buyer enter a PPA with any developer across the United States, or will they have to enter that with just their local utilities?
Actually, the buyer can enter into a PPA with any developer across US, as long as that developer can inject the power at the required node in the electric system where the buyer would require. So if you're a buyer in Texas, and if the developer is somewhere in Seattle, theoretically speaking, you can enter into that agreement, provided that a buyer can deliver the power that's generated in Seattle all the way down Texas. Now, while it can work, but typically what happens is the farther you're away from the source of consumption, from the consumption of the energy, the power becomes more expensive because it's not just the generation cost, but it also the transmission costs add up. There's a issue of balancing and system efficiency losses. So effectively, whatever you might end up saving in pricing, you would end up paying more from a transmission standpoint.
Okay, so what you're saying is that really, as long as physical delivery of power is possible, a PPA can be executed with a developer located really anywhere in the United States.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So now that we have an idea about PPAs, can you explain what a virtual power purchase agreement, what those are, and how are they different from that traditional PPA?
Sure. So to simply understand what VPPAs are, they are they're more of financial contracts, right? It's what you have in a typical PPA is a physical delivery of power. That really doesn't happen in the VPPAs. So we need to think about VPPAs more less of a power purchase agreement, as in buying the power, but more about power price assurance agreements. So what do I mean by that? Now, same as your general traditional PPA, you still have two parties. You have the seller, you have the buyer. They both agree on a price for a certain amount of tenure. So that's common between both VPPA and as well as your traditional PPA. But what exactly happens is while they do agree on the price, the buyer doesn't take the delivery of the power. The power is in fact delivered to the local market, right? And whatever the price that the seller gets in the local market, if it is less than the price that's there in the VPPA contract, then the buyer compensates that difference. And similarly, if let's say the price that the developer or the seller gets in the local market is higher than the price that's there in the PPA contract, in the VPPA contract, then they'll have to pay that excess amount back to the buyer. So essentially, if I were to speak purely from a financial standpoint, this is what we call a float to fixed swap. So the developer over here is fixing his or her future cash flow in terms of revenue against the floating. So the price risk is essentially onboarded to the buyer. Now, because the buyer takes on the price risk, they and that is and because the buyer takes on the price risk, they're essentially responsible for allowing the project to even happen in the first place. And that is the reason they get to own the RECs that are generated from the project.
Okay, so, well, before we continue, maybe you could expand on what exactly is a REC.
Sure. So REC is it's a simple certificate, right? It's what we call it as a renewable energy certificate. So essentially, the reason why you have RECs is it's more like let's say a symbol or not. I would say a symbol of the environmental attributes. For example, let's say if you're working on a renewable project, you're generating power without burning any fossils. Now, at the same time, you also use certain type of you're providing extra community support, right, for the local community. So there's a community support angle as well. So these are all attributes of a power, right? Power is just not just the energy. It also has the whole point of doing the renewables is to drive that energy transition, right? To drive more, let's say, environmental focused energy. So all these attributes, social, environmental, all these are captured in a certificate called a REC, and then these RECs are tradable instruments. So if you're a developer who generates energy through renewable power, then they can sell those RECs as a standalone to another buyers who want to buy those RECs.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, essentially a VPPA is a hedge instrument for the sellers to fix their revenue. And since the buyer takes on the price risk, they're the ones enabling developers to get the project financing in the first place. And therefore, they receive the RECs as compensation for the risk. Is that correct?
Absolutely, you summed it perfect, Colleen. But I just want to add one clarification to it. It's yes, it is a hedge instrument for the seller in terms of fixing their future revenue, but it's also a hedge instrument for the buyer. We need to keep that in mind. It's not just a hedge instrument for the seller, but it's also a hedge instrument for the buyer over here.
Maybe tell us more about how that works. Wouldn't buyers not be taking the risk?
Oh no, so buyers would take on the price risk. So a VPPA contract, buyers essentially would take on the price risk. But we also need to remember that in a VPPA contract, the buyer is not taking delivery of power. So they have to maintain their current existing contract with the local utility. So I'll take an example. Maybe I'll explain it with an example. So let's assume you're a buyer, you're a company based in Houston, Texas, and there is a wind farm in Lubbock, and it's a totally different side of Texas. It's got a separate grid altogether. And let's say you enter into a VPPA with the wind farm in Lubbock. Now, what happens is if tomorrow the prices go up, so since you're not taking the delivery of power from the wind farm, you still have to take the delivery of power from your local utility, right? So if you're in Houston, you'll go to your center point energy, you'll take power from them. Now, tomorrow, if the prices in the Houston go up, naturally, because the prices across Texas start seeing significant spikes. So you'll also see the prices in Lubbock go up because they're geographically very close, right? So whatever benefit that you're getting, whatever profit that you're getting from your VPPA deal, that profit essentially offsets the price increase that you're seeing in Houston. So in that way, it works as a hedge. So it requires a very delicate structuring of the instrument. And when they're structured properly, it could be a very powerful hedge. And we have seen a lot of companies using VPPA specifically. It originally started out as an instrument to drive a clean energy transition, but they're now using it to manage the risk more effectively.
Okay, that makes sense. So given the fact that there's no physical delivery of power, does that mean that the buyer can enter a VPPA with a developer located anywhere in the world?
Unfortunately, that's not the case. It would have been great if that was the case, but that's not really the case. Yes, there is no physical delivery of power. So theoretically speaking, you can practically enter into VPPA with any developer in the world. So from a theory standpoint, but while there is no physical delivery of power, the challenge that you face is RECs. So we spoke a bit about this, but I want to elaborate a bit more about how the RECs are recognized. So the RECs today are very territorial in nature, right? So these RECs are recognized not at a federal level in US. They're recognized by different states. You don't really have one federal law that says, hey, this is what the REC is, this is the definition of the REC, this is what constitutes a REC, and this is what you need to do. It doesn't work that way. Every state in US has its own definition of what a REC is, because fundamentally the purpose of a REC is to meet the renewable portfolio standards of that particular state. So, for example, if you're in, I would say Alabama, they would say, okay, for us to consider that REC as a primary REC, the project should be based out in Alabama, right? Or it has to be a wind power project. So every state has certain rules associated with RECs. So all RECs are not created equal. That is number one. Number two, the RECs, most of the states in US only recognize RECs that are part of the REC tracking system. So there's something called an RTS, which is what we call in industry. So essentially, whenever a developer is generating clean energy, they get RECs which are generated with their local RTO or ISO organizations. So they run these tracking systems so that there's a transparency in terms of the origination of the REC, right? So almost every state in US recognizes RECs that are associated with any of these 10 different tracking system, and even Canada. So a lot of US based tracking RTS are also recognizing the RECs that are generated out of Canada. So as long as if you have a REC that is recognized by this RTS system, you can theoretically speaking get into agreement with any developer across the world. But unfortunately, the US laws do not allow for that to happen. And so any REC that you would produce, let's say in India, would not be considered an equivalent, and you can't really claim the benefits out of that REC.
Okay, so let's expand on this just a bit. Given that net zero transition is the primary driver for VPPAs, doesn't it make sense then to directly purchase RECs instead of entering into a VPPA?
Yeah, that's actually a good point. And in fact, you're right. That's what's happening today.
Mhm.
About if you look at the data, I will give you a simple statistic. Last year in 2022, I'm talking about December 2020, December 21 to December 22, there were about 300,000 businesses in US who purchased RECs directly. They didn't enter into VPPAs. Whereas the businesses that entered into a VPPA contracts were just 600. So you see the stark difference. The RECs today are the predominant form of the clean energy transition tool. They are the most predominant form. Lot of companies today rely on RECs to claim their clean energy transition. So they buy RECs on a regular basis from these power developers who generate these RECs. But having said that, think this is all historical. We need to keep the whole timeline in context, right? So the whole renewable energy really started picking up from early 2010. You started seeing these carbon credits coming in, and you start seeing a huge growth. Now, my understanding and my belief is that the VPPA is going to be the tool that's going to drive the future energy transition. You'll slowly start seeing the VPPA keep on going up in terms of managing their energy transition for it's two simple reasons primarily because one is the sustainability impact, right? So whole point of all this, if you look at all the clean energy transition, the sustainability policies, the claims that the companies make in their annual reports, they keep saying that we created X amount of, let's say, about 100,000 megawatts of 100,000 megawatt hours of clean energy in this region, so on and so forth. We are fully clean, fully sustainable. The whole point of sustainability and these RECs are to drive new capacity, new renewable energy capacity, to create new capacity in the market, right? So that's why that's why there's huge pressure on a lot of the boards and these companies from their investors to be more sustainable. The whole idea is to drive that capacity expansion. When you buy a rec from the market, you did not really pay any role in creating that capacity. So somebody else would have financed that capacity. So somebody else would have financed the project, and now you're getting an outcome of the project, and so you're directly buying the rec.
Mhm.
So you're essentially claiming that you're creating sustainability, but you're not. I mean, you're really creating a new capacity, but you're really not. You're just buying the output of that capacity. Whereas in case of VPPAs, because you're taking on the price risk, that is the reason why those assets are being created. So essentially, you're directly impacting the creation of the new renewable energy capacity and expansion of that capacity. And we have already seen this happen with a couple of our clients and in the market in general. There's a lot of criticism about greenwashing. I typically don't like using the term, but uh, a lot of activist groups who are saying that all these carbon offsets, all these recs, they're not true sustainable sustainability impact these companies claim. And as these claims start going up about the greenwashing, you start seeing a lot of pressure on companies to move away from just purchase of recs. So that is one aspect of the whole thing. Then there's a second aspect, right? So you have the cost. So rec is always a recurring expense. So you will have to buy rec for certain megawatt hour every time you have to claim, every time you have to use it for offsetting your carbon emissions. The VPPAs are not, right? We discussed, right? It's you don't pay for the rec, you pay for the risk. So as long as you hedge your VPPAs properly, you not just allow new capacity to be created, but you also get recs which are additionality and which are for free of cost essentially, and even at a lower cost as long as you structure the rec properly.
Thanks for that, Sai. So a question that I'm sure is on the mind of many in our audience: what type of companies are major buyers of the VPPA right now?
As of today, uh, the majority of purchase, right? I would say about 90 to 95% of what we see in the market is essentially large scale corporations. The Fortune 500 companies, the Googles of the world, the Microsoft, the Kellogg's, the DuPonts, really huge companies with multi-billion-dollar revenue with presence across different parts of the US and the globe, right? So they are the ones who buy these recs, and you don't really see small scale companies buying them today. So it's primarily focused on certain set of buyers who are really having enormous scale.
Okay, so are there any VPPA use cases for utilities that you can share with us?
Sure. So before I do share about the VPPA use case, I just want to say why utilities can play a critical role in the VPPA adoption. Because as of today, the reason why you don't have really large companies, really large companies dominating the VPPA market, and you don't see smaller companies coming in and entering into VPPA transactions is three major reasons. One is the scale.
Mhm.
So you need to have about 100,000 megawatt hours of annual load to get a price that makes sense. That's feasible. And a lot of companies don't have that kind of a scale, right? Only the large scale retail companies or your big office spaces, they have those kind of scale. The second is the complexity. It's, as you would have understood by now, VPPA is a bit of a complex agreement. There are a lot of loose ends, and even the contracting process is quite complex. Unlike, let's say, a PPA, so you'll have to spend a good amount of time. You need to understand the risks because you're entering into a potentially a 20-year, a 2-decade deal which you can't get out of. So there's a huge kind of capability that is required to negotiate deals of this size, and a lot of smaller companies don't have that. And similarly, you have the financial risk, right? It's an add-on to the complexity that I was talking about, because you're essentially fixing your prices for the next 20 years,
Hmm.
and you're fixing the prices for the supplier, but you are exposing yourself to the market. So if you don't do the pricing structure properly, you would end up seeing significant amount of losses. So these are the three reasons that usually prohibit a widespread adoption of VPPs. Now that we have clarified what the reasons are, I'll come to your main question, which is what can utilities do here? I
Yes,
think
thank you.
utilities can act as market makers, right? So utilities have the scale, utilities have the financial capability, and utilities also have the technical capability. So when I say market maker, what I essentially mean is they can work with their smaller customers in their service territory to aggregate that demand, and then they could then negotiate that VPPA agreement with the developer, and then act as that middle player to negotiate a good contract, and at the same time they could also provide liquidity to the market. So right now, when you enter into a VPPA deal, there is no other way for you to get out of it. These are all over the counter, right? So you will have to, there's no liquidity in the market. But whereas if there is a utility in that particular service territory, they could essentially potentially provide that liquidity support. They could say that, okay, company A with 10-year PPVPPA deal, you will have to, let's say, your 10-year VPPA deal, they want to get out after 2 years. There's another company B that's interested. They could facilitate that transaction. And in fact, the spread that utilities can get out of market making could be significant additional source of revenue for the utilities.
Okay, so then in summary, what I take from this is that a utility will execute the VPPA with the developer, and then they'll create smaller trenches of those VPPAs and then sell those trenches to individual businesses in their territory. Is that right?
Absolutely. That's essentially the process. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So I know we've got a lot of questions that are being populated. We'll hold those to the end of our session. Some of these might get answered throughout, but aside, building on what we've been talking about, what are some of the other risks outside of the price risks that buyers must consider when entering a VPPA transaction?
Sure. So there are outside the price risk. I would say first you always start with the counterparty risk. The party that you're dealing with, what is their financial capability, what is their past experience, whether that is there a possibility that that other party can go bankrupt, right? Or they might not take, they might not generate. For buyer, it would be that, okay, seller might not be able to generate the amount of volumes that we're looking at, uh, or they might not really meet our expectations in terms of the pricing that we looked at. And for in terms of buyer, in terms of seller, that would be, what if my buyer is going to go bankrupt? So there's always a two-way risk. So one is the counterparty risk. The second one would be the renewable penetration. So if if you're considering a project that's in a very hot area, right? Like a area where there's a lot of new projects coming up. So if you take Texas, I like saying Texas because it's like that belt with a lot of wind farms. So let's say you're considering a wind project in Texas, and there are about 20 new projects coming around it. Now, if all of them have a similar production profile, what ends up happening is when there's a wind flow, they're all going to produce the energy at the same time. So when the volumes go up, because you need to understand the pricing of the energy is done on an hourly basis in the market. It's not really one price for the whole day. It's on every hour. So when every project releases the same power for that particular hour, if their production profile is similar, the prices drop significantly. So you're on hold if you have a lot of renewable energy penetration there. And similarly, you also have I would say outside these two, you would have the risk on uh, the project project generating volumes. So that's one side of the risk that we discussed on the renewable penetration. The other side of risk is when the project delivers volume when I would say the price is low. So that's also I mean it sounds similar, but it's a bit different. For example, this is what we call in utilities a shape risk, which is basically that you have been told that you're going to get certain amount of volume every hour, right? And when that doesn't match, your aggregate price of the contract value changes at the end of the day. So it's a huge risk from a price standpoint. And so these are some of the risks that outside the price risk that buyers should consider when they enter into a VPPA contract.
Okay, so given those risks, Sai, what can the buyer do to mitigate some of these risks?
Uh, so I would say there are 4 stages of mitigating a risk. If you think from a purely from a procurement standpoint, right? So there are 4 stages of risk mitigation when you look at it from procurement process. The one is assessing the viability of the project, right? So you look at whether is that project going to generate enough revenue? Is that project first of all, will the project even be developed in right time? Because it's not that easy to set up a renewable project, right? Because a lot of these contracts, VPPA contracts, usually happen much before the project is even permitted or project under construction. A lot of these happen during the proposed stage. So you don't really have a project on the ground. You might not have any permitting done. You might not have any licenses that you would require. So you're essentially betting on the fact that the developer will be able to build the project in the right time in the next 2 years. So that means you'll have to look at their project financing. Have they got enough money to build the project? Do they have is the project going to generate enough money, right? Like in terms of revenue. Again, looking at the renewable penetration piece, and then there are also things like is the project operationally viable, right? Like can it produce enough amount of energy that you're expecting? So you could look at the other projects in the region, for example, in that particular region, to see how those projects are producing their volumes every hour, to assess the proposed project whether this will be able to produce similarly or not. So that's on the project viability. The second is the developer itself. Now, what experience does this developer have? How many megawatt hours worth of projects has he constructed in the past, right? And what is their past O&M experience in owning and managing the project? What is the focus? For example, you have developers like banks, investment banks, who are funding to develop these projects so that they could sell these projects after some time. You have private equity firms doing it. But then you also have companies like utilities who are doing these projects so that they could generate the power and own and operate them going forward. So you need to take these into consideration. And then the third stage is negotiating contracts, right? So when you negotiate contracts, you need to make sure your prices, you're choosing the right pricing structure. So I see that there was some question about what are some of the levers used to hedge the price risk. Maybe I can answer some of that over here. So a pricing structure could be of multiple types. You could have a floating price, you could have a discount to market price with floor, with cap, you can have a collar with a min-max pricing. So you could choose whatever the pricing that works the best. And then you also look at the liquidated damages, right? Now, what if the supplier doesn't produce enough amount of energy that you want? So you will so that's a problem for you, because you'll end up facing the losses, and you'll have to have contractual terms that heads that risk. And at the same time, the assignment rights. So if tomorrow the developer wants to sell the project to somebody else, your utilities or the buyers, whoever they are, they should have the right to say, to have the first right to refuse or first right to approve, right? So things on that lines, availability guarantee that the project will be able to deliver 95% of the promised volumes, and more fundamentally important, the production profile guarantee. So you are building the whole project based on the expectation that this project will deliver this much amount of energy every hour for the next 30 years. What is the guarantee that it will do all that or not? So if it goes down, then what should be the penalties when the seller is not able to hit those guarantees? So we need to look at all these three things. And the final one, I would say, the company needs to have a portfolio strategy. They need to have a portfolio approach. When I say portfolio approach, what I mean is, you don't put all, we say this in stock market, right? You don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? So you need to have the diversification. So when you are looking to source about, let's say, 100 megawatts of VPPA, you would ideally want to put 20 megawatts in one region, 30 in the other, with different tenures, with different types of risk profiles, operation profile, and things of that nature. So the first three are the project level, and the fourth is at a company level. So when a company can have that clear renewable portfolio strategy, all these should mitigate those risks that we were talking about.
Okay. So, Sai, I know I said I was going to wait until the last 15 minutes to take audience questions, but I see a lot being populated, some questions on what we've just talked about. So I'm going to jump and dive right into some of those questions. For example, since we're talking about risks, Monish asked, what are some of the levers used to hedge the price risk?
Yeah, so so there are two types of levers. One is the price focused, the other is the volume. I hit a bit about the price focused levers. So you could always set a floor price beyond which you'll not be willing to pay the developer if the price goes below certain level of number. And you could also have a collar, where you could have a floor and you could have a cap, and the price and the contract will only work as long as the price is between those particular limits. You could also have a discount to market cap, right? This is a bit more riskier, which is where you can tell, okay, in the ERCOT market for this particular node or this particular hub, I'm going to pay you 20% discount of that market price. So you're not fixing the price. What you're doing is, how the market price moves, you're essentially doing the discounting on that market price. And this could again be combined with a floor and a cap. So there are very innovative tools to manage the pricing side of things. The second one is the volume, right? The volume curtailment. It's a very important question, and this is something that we couldn't discuss earlier. The curtailment is a very critical feature of a VPPA project or any PPA project. Now, if the prices go down to a point where there's a tremendous loss, sometimes markets behave strangely, right? Where there's a tremendous loss for either party, or especially for buyer, then buyer should be able to curtail certain amount of volume that they promised in the contract. So typically you could say, okay, I'm going to consume about 100,000 megawatt of years every year. So that means I'm going to pay you the price change for that 100,000 megawatts. So you could potentially negotiate a clause in which says that I'm not going to pay you 100% of it. I retain the right to pay only 70% of it. So at least you save that 30% on the overall volumes. So again, there are a lot of strategies, there are a lot of ways to do it. There's a lot of statistical analysis involved, but I would say this would be that higher level approach to managing the price risk.
Okay, thank you, Sai. So switching gears just a little bit, looking at Priyanka's question, she asks, so what are the recommendations on creating the new renewable capacity through VPPAs beyond the criticism and doubts?
Okay. I would say, I think you would have heard from me by now, I'm a huge champion of VPPA any day. And I think it's a great tool. We have seen with organizations when it's properly used and it's hedged out properly, it delivers tremendous results. We have seen cases where the organizations not just minimize their down risk, but also ended up making a lot of money. Of course, making money or profit is not the primary objective through the VPPA, but uh, but you have that flexibility in terms of how you're structuring it. So I would say VPPAs are a critical tool to drive that capacity expansion. Uh, and if you think about it, how would you drive a renewable capacity expansion, right? So there are only two ways. One is either you build the asset on your own, or you do a power purchase agreement with another entity that's building the asset. The challenge with traditional PPAs is, for example, if you're in West Virginia, right? Anyone who knows West Virginia would know that it's a very fossil fuel heavy state, right?
Yes.
And if you want to take a PPA, if you want to do a physical PPA in West Virginia, the kind of pricing that you would get to get the energy from another state all the way to your node, it's going to be very cost prohibitive. But you could still support a renewable capacity expansion through the VPPA. So I think VPPAs are absolutely critical tools, and I think this is something that companies will have to seriously consider in their renewable portfolio strategy.
Okay. So, Sai, I've got a really interesting question here. Nishant writes, "Hi, Sai. Since you mentioned 2022, do you think the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 has had any impact on the virtual PPAs that are out there?"
Yeah, that's a good question. So, not really, not directly on VPPAs at least. So IRA, if you look at IRA, it impacts the general capacity additions, right? So it really doesn't say that, okay, if you're using a VPPA, I want to get this credit or not. So it doesn't work that way. So IRA primarily provides the production and tax investment credits to any project that creates new renewable capacity, and that's not really VPPA specific. So that's number one. Number two is you have to look at the historical trend, right? Now, if you look at back in 2010, if you look at the amount of PPAs that were being done, majority were physical PPAs. First of all, the overall power purchase agreements were quite low, and even then, about maybe 5% of what we are doing today in every year. So it was that low, and within that you have a lot of physical PPAs. But if you look at since then, all the way till 2020, right? You can take out 21, 22. Today, as of now, in terms of corporate market, about 80% of the PPA, I'm not talking about utilities, but corporate companies, about 80% of them are VPPAs as of today. So even before the Inflation Reduction Act, VPPAs have been growing significantly, and they will only continue to grow.
Good. So a point of clarification here, Sai. Devaya asks, do utilities also buy VPPAs?
Yes. So we have not. It's not widespread. So we have seen few utilities buying small portions of VPPAs, not significant. I think one in California, one of the Palo Alto, from what I remember. I can get back to Divya on that exact specifics with respect to which utility did it, but they are buying, and it's a very limited adoption at this point in time, and that's because what we just discussed, right? So it's primarily a corporate tool, but from a utility standpoint, I can give you another use case. So if for utilities, if you look at today, one of the biggest challenge in the whole energy transition is the reliability of the grid. You are moving from baseload plants. Your 30, 40 years back, your assets were your resources were quite standard, right? You had the coal, you had the fossil, you had the nuclear. These were all baseload plants. You knew how much they are going to generate every hour, right, going forward. So that was very clear. But as we enter into the energy transition, the capacity factor of a lot of these new technologies, the solar, the wind. So wind will only generate when there's wind around, right? It will not really generate beyond that. So it's limited. What that does is, because the generation is really driven by a lot of these natural let's say environment situations or weather situations, it adds a new level of uncertainty to the grid. And because of that, you have all investments that are right now happening, even with IRA on the storage and on the BESS side. What utilities can do is, if they want to quickly quickly do the energy transition, and if they have good amount of life in their existing assets, right, that the fossils, and from a cost standpoint, if it is going to be extremely expensive for them to do the transition, because end of the day, people have to remember that end of the day, utilities is the community, right? It's the people who are going to end up paying those costs, right? So if the costs are too prohibitive, and these are especially when you don't have a lot of development in that part of the region, like I said, West Virginia or the southern part of the US, except maybe Texas and other places, you don't really see a lot of significant amount of these projects coming up. And in that case, it kind of makes sense to enter into VPPA and get the RECs, while to offset your emissions from your current plant, rather than investing in a physical PPA or building the whole thing on your own, unless fundamentally the utility has decided that no, they want to go for a full clean state, they want to go out and do the whole transition themselves. A bit a longer answer, Divya, but I think would be my submission.
Yeah, no, this is really great. Thank you. I do have another question here from Beth. She asks, are there any standards in terms of VPPA contracting templates?
Yeah, so we do have them. So VPPAs are essentially derivatives, right? Like what we discussed, it's a swap, and swap is a derivative. So we have ISDA. It's an association of derivatives traders that do all those over-the-counter products. So we have template from ISDA, we have a template from Energy Edison Institute, and from couple of other from couple of other entities as well that are available, and a lot of them are used. So in fact, ISDA is a preferred template used in a lot of these VPPA transactions today.
Great, Sai. This has been really, really helpful. I think we're just about out of time, and really appreciate everyone's participation today. Thank you, Sai. We sincerely hope that everyone in our audience found our session enjoyable, valuable, and that you had several takeaways. If you had any other questions that you'd like to discuss, or topics on how GEP can help your organization, please don't hesitate to contact me. Again, 𝐀𝐠𝐞𝐧𝐝𝐚 with GEP. Thank you all. Hope you have a great day ahead.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate being here. Thank you.
Thank you.